Yeah. Let me ask you this, Tommy. Was there ever a time when you became frustrated because you didn't see like Henry yet? I mean, when you're in the growing process.
Well, Al, you've got an interesting remark there in that question, because you didn't see like Henry yet. Henry didn't want us to see like Henry. Henry wanted each one of us to develop our own individual vision. And the only way that we could do that was by following the principles that he was trying to get us to understand. And I think that's what you meant by the question.
In other words, there is nature dictates to us the light key. However, there are various artists that are in various stages of growth.
Right.
Depending on which you contribute to the discipline.
Right.
You see? I mean, you only get out of what you put in it.
Right.
Henry has said that a lot too.
Well, this is...
But I mean, was there a time that you felt frustrated because you wasn't keying it right?
I started with Sammy in January of '69. This is October of 2009. Not one day has passed since the day I started up until today that the thought has not gone through my head at least once, I'm going to quit painting. And some days that thought would be in my head from the time I got out of bed in the morning till I went to bed at night. I'm going to quit this crap. I'm not going to do this anymore. I ain't playing. I'm fed up, You bang your head against the wall. You don't get anywhere. And then all of a sudden you'll have a breakthrough. And you'll start thinking, "Hell, I'll beat the old man. I'm going to beat him now." And it encourages you to keep on working. But it brings up the idea that Henry talked about. In 86, no, it was in 85, I'd seen Henry down at Dottie's in November of 83, which I hadn't seen him since 74 in Provincetown. So it'd been almost 10 years. And drove down and visited with him, and brought some paintings, brought 10 paintings, and he looked at them and just gave me all sorts of hell. I'm telling you, he took them apart, put them back together, so on and so on. And when he got through, he says, "Okay, now you ladies can all tell him how great he is." But he understood. He knew exactly what I needed. So he didn't tell me, "Yeah, you're doing good." No, he showed me where I was coming up short on everything, and which is why I brought them. So 2 years later in 85, I flew up to Boston. Guys drove me out to Provincetown and was with him a couple of weeks out there then. And he took me aside one day and he said, there's some things that you really need to understand that you don't quite understand. Some things you do and some things you don't. He said, first of all, there's study and there's performance. And we shouldn't confuse them. They're two very different things. He said, we have to have both of them. We have to study in order to improve our performances. And what our performances do is tell us and show us where we are in our development. So if we study all the time, we'll never really know how well we're developing, because we haven't taken a chance on seeing where our knowledge is. And by the same token, if all we do is performances, if all we do is paintings, pictures, then our knowledge base no longer grows, and we'll end up repeating ourselves over and over. It says, and eventually bore our audience and then bore ourselves into quitting painting. Right. Because the love behind it. He said, your problem is that you studied for a period and then you stopped studying and you've done all these performances. He says, now it's time to go back to studying again. He says, but you need to be studying in the right way. He said, and unless you do what I'm fixing to tell you, all the way to the end, you might as well not even start. He said, I can't tell you how many years it's going to take for you to have a clear understanding of what it is I'm telling you. He said, you've gone about things backwards. He said, usually people study and they learn to model the forms and so forth and so on. And in doing that, they learn about the light keys and learn to see the light keys, and says, you did just the opposite. You went out into nature and studied the light keys first. He said, and you see them well. He says, you may have painted more light keys than I have. He said, but you did it at the expense of all the form. He says, if you're going to be a real painter, there has to be a balance between the light key and the form and the volumes and the arrangement and the rhythmic flow of the forms and the rhythmic flow of the light through the forms.
Proportion in the masses.
It's all is involved. He says, so what you got to do is back up and go back to elementary school, go back to refining your masses and then modeling the forms until the modeling becomes a second nature to you as seeing the light keys. He says, and then once that happens, then it's time to integrate the two so that they're seamless and there's no contradiction between either one of them.
Okay, what you said just now was key to what I've been trying to get at. Okay, now there's another area. Henry always taught us to see the key. Mm-hmm. You know, of course, perhaps I didn't get to the level yet where he would come to me and talk to me like that. You see, but when you said the modeling the form, you know, I always took for granted that you modeled the form or the proportion of the masses as you studied the key. You see what I'm saying?
Well, there are 4 or 5 different things involved there, Al. Number one, let's start the elementary rock bottom of the masses. The large mass of light and the large mass of shade of each object and the background, let's say if it's a still life setup, and the tabletop in light and the tabletop cast shadows. The masses themselves, once they're refined to the proper degree of relationship between each one, will produce the light key without you ever thinking about the light key. See, there's one of the problems. People start thinking about light keys. Oh yeah, morning is cooler than afternoon, so I'll use more pinks and blues in the morning and more orange and yellows in the afternoon. Well, that's bogus. It's true that generally speaking, afternoon is warmer than morning is. But you can have warm morning light keys and you can have cool afternoon light keys. The best lesson to me on that was Henry pulled out a landscape somewhere along there, 72, 73, 74, somewhere in there, that I made a comment about. I said, Henry, it's such a beautiful morning landscape because all his shadows were atmospheric and cool. It was a middle of the afternoon hazy atmospheric thing. And because my eye was not keen enough to understand the subtle relationship between his warm and cool notes, I took for granted, because I had the concept in my mind that mornings were cooler, etc., that was a morning painting. So that was a big lesson for me, which I never, it was such a lesson that I never took any of that for granted again. But back to the idea of the masses. He has everyone start the masses, the light plane and the shadow plane of each object or the tabletop, with raw, vivid color for 2 reasons. One is to get the shock of nature, but the other, it was also a shock, which to shock the mind out of its complacency and its
preconceived notion.
Preconceived and its programming. Exactly. Our brain, our perceptual areas, have a default setting which is black and white, which does not contain color of any sort, as our brains have developed to the degree that they have. Because in seeing in black and white, you see stark differences. You see movement. You know, it's for survival. You know, you see the wild animal movement when it's far enough away that you can escape and so forth and so on. Because in truth, color actually camouflages movement and all sorts of other things. But anyway, the masses, the stark, raw coloration, then we make the comparison between the raw notes that we have on the board, say the yellow in this light plane, and the actual note that's on the light plane of that object. And we say, okay, it has that type warmth, but what else is in it? Well, there's some kind of pale blue-green as part of it too. So you mix that up and you mix that with the yellow. And then you go to the next note And then you come back to that light plane that you started with yellow and now has a little bit of blue-green in it. Well, it almost looks like it's a pale magenta in it also. And you mix that and you put that in. And you go around and you refine and you refine and refine, make a comparison, make comparison, make comparison. Until by the time you have restated everything 3, 5, 6 times, without ever thinking about the light key, the light key will appear there on the board all by itself because you have done exactly what Henry told you to do. Get the color relations true by comparison, comparison, comparison. And that's the fundamental basic root of everything that he taught. Now, after we've got those refined relationships, actually he told me one day, he said, people should restate their masses at least 3 times, preferably 5. But usually by the time you've restated it the 3rd time, that's as good as you can see it for your level of development. He said, here's the test. He says, look at your notes in comparison and mix the note, the single note that you think you see that's in that mass on your palette and stick it on top of that mass. And he says, if you don't see any difference between what you mixed and stuck on there, then you've reached the end of your seeing, your level of seeing for that thing. So now it's time to go on and try to make variations and see if you can't refine the masses with the variations. So there we look at the top of the mass note and the middle and the bottom and try to make the visual comparisons. The top of this note in light is a little bit warmer than the bottom. The bottom's a little bit cooler. So, it looks a little oranger, so I add a little orange to that. The middle looks a little greener, add a little green to that. The bottom looks a little bluer, add a little blue to that. So we're refining the quality of the mass with the variations and also causing the form to turn just a little bit. But that's not modeling per se. That's variations within the mass. And those variations will refine that mass note to an even higher degree than we were capable of by making small incremental changes. So he would have people work on masses for 1 summer, 2 summers, 3 summers, 4 summers. He would not let people go on to the next level of development until he thought they were ready for it. People these days, I've done a couple of bright ones, now I want to get on to the more fun, I want to make a picture out of it. Now, you're talking about years and years, roughly about 10 years, from the time you started your first overcolor masses until you've learned the refinements of color variations and the modeling of forms and the working of edges to where the forms turn in space and so forth and so on. That takes about 10 years worth of refinement of somebody working all the time, not just 2 weeks or 2 months in the summertime.
I agree, 100%.
So,
a thing can't give off what it doesn't have. And if you don't understand the concept and you haven't done enough of the discipline and study, you can't produce what you're seeing until you go through enough trial and error.
Exactly, and that's the problem, Ali. It's all trial and error. There's no formula. And you find people making up formulas to make it easier for themselves. And that's only human nature. And from a certain standpoint, it can be forgiven in that not everyone is a Henry Hensche. See, Henry was on a mission to understand and express visually the full depth and capacity that his visual perception was capable of developing within itself. There's no going back. It's like John tells the story there a few weeks before Henry died. He's talking to Henry, and Henry held up his hand and said, "John, if I just had 5 more years, I think I could have really done something with painting." Now here's somebody who's painted 75 years and wishes he had 5 more, and then I'd really show you guys something. So that most people. Charlie Miller said something interesting years ago. He said the reason people allow their drawing to develop at a faster rate than their color is because if you learn to draw well, you can sell your work and make a living. And Charlie wasn't selling that as an idea. He was simply making the statement that the reason people don't stick with what Henry was trying to get them to understand long enough to develop the way he developed was that, there are these unless you got a suitcase full of money these days, you're not going to survive in any country, especially ours. And so making a living and the economic aspects of it become pretty paramount for folks. The problem is, though, a person can make a living without compromising the ideals. Henry did, and a number of other people have also. But that requires a certain amount of faith of all sorts. And one is having faith in these ideas that if I stick with them, I will develop to a degree that people, Henry said, if you do good work, people will find you. You don't have to go out trying to sell your stuff to people. And he was exactly right. He was exactly right about that. But that next stage of development, after we've done the refinement of masses and variations until we, like you say, we have a clear perception of the light key. We're not able to mix a note and nail it the first note, but we know how to sneak up on it. We know how to make the comparison and say, yeah, I got a glimpse of that. There's something in that cast shadow that's almost as luminous as the light plane. The shadow note's not darker than the light plane, it's just a different color. So once I stop thinking in black and white and see these things as luminous notes of color, then all of a sudden the light key appears and you make your comparisons. Well, after we've got our refined masses, then there's the modeling the volumes of the form. And Henry had students do that generally by making geometric planes. Now, each note of color has a very specific shape, but usually our vision's not refined enough at the beginning to see that unique shape of each particular color. So he had people break things into 3 large planes first, the light plane, the shadow note, and the half light plane in the middle, and then break those planes into 2 or 3 divisions up and down, and model them in geometric flat notes of color for 2 reasons. One was to keep the colors separate so we wouldn't fuzz them together and make it look like a finished picture. The other thing was so that people would understand the sculptural volumes of the forms, because you were sculpting, instead of sculpting with clay, you were sculpting with color. Just like you make a blob of plasticine and you take a knife and you cut and you make a plane there and you cut and you make a plane here, and that causes form change. When we're sculpting with paint, we've got a pink here and a green here and a brown violet here, and it causes the eye to think, look, there's a sculptural form there. Now, a lot of people complain, oh, but that's so unnatural, blah, 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 blah. Well, what's not unnatural about it is that we're coming to an understanding, perceptually, of volumes, so that our eye reaches out and looks at a head and can feel the volume and weight of that head without ever touching it with the finger, by only touching it with the eye. So all the different things that he had people do up through their development were all geared specifically towards a final perceptual goal. And we started off very crude and savage, as he used to like to say. We learned to first see by the primary colors, then by the secondaries, then by the tertiaries, and then by seeing the colors that are not so colored as colors. The English called it legitimate exaggeration.
Legitimate exaggeration.
Yeah. See, we start off raw, and then we learn to exaggerate the color, and then as we refine the color, we understand that in order for paint to reproduce nature, we're going to have to exaggerate it sometimes a little bit. Well, there's legitimate exaggeration that will still appear to be like nature, and not like the raw yellows, purples, and greens that we started off with when we were ranked beginners. But all geared towards everyone finally having a perceptual development where we would want to tackle more complex, more complicated color arrangements. We'd no longer set up a red block and a yellow block on a pale blue cloth, a cliche as it were after a point. We can look back at some of Henry's paintings where he had a rusty iron pot, a little worn wooden carved buffalo, some pine cones, and some dried pieces of grass. Well, where's the color, Henry, in that setup? Oh, there's plenty of color there. But it's subtle and nebulous and poetic and mysterious. It's not red, green, yellow, purple. It's a red, green, violet, gray next to a bluish turquoisey brown, if you want to name the components in the color. Sir Alfred East, his book, Oil Painting in Color from 1906, was a book that Henry carried with him everywhere he went. When he'd leave Provincetown and come down to Dottie's in the winter, he brought that book with him because there was something about all the things East had to say that was extremely important to him. Matter of fact, he learned to paint the landscape from following what East had to say, not from what Hawthorne had to say. But East said, when you look at a good painter's work, when you're standing in front of that painting, he said you might stand there for 15 or 20 minutes before your eye actually realizes what it is that makes up the colors on the painting. He says he will all of a sudden make you think that there's blue and orange and red, but when you look at it, there's no blue, orange, or red there. But there's these subtle refinements of relationships that when laying next to each other appear to the eye to be orange and red. Al, he did a little landscape demo in '86 where the first note that he reached down and picked up was burnt sienna off his palette. And he smeared a big blob of it up here high. And like everybody else, I scratched my head thinking, well, what the hell's the old man doing? And then he mixes up another note and puts behind that, and you realize he's used that burnt sienna out of the tube as the light plane, but it looked like mud. And then he did the next note, and then he'd come back and did the sky. By the time he had put down his 12 or 15 initial notes, that burnt sienna off the palette scraped up there by itself looked like bright orange sunlight on the front of the tree. So, he would tell us one thing and start us a certain other way, and this, that, and the other, but then he would think to himself, what can I do to him today to get him to understand that that light plane on that tree in the afternoon is not orange out of the tube. So he uses a burnt brown and has it appear orange because of the relationship in it. So that's,
so the ends justifies the means in a sense.
Well, when you have a perception as advanced as his, there's more than one way to skin the cat. There's more than one way to get an orange light plane. It has nothing to do with cadmium orange.
It has to do with color relationships around it. Exactly. By the time he put that blue-violet shadow behind that brown, it was already beginning to luminesce as a beautiful warm note, and by the time he had his sky note around it and everything, it was obvious that this is warm light. It no longer mattered that it was a bush or that it was even an orangey note or which pigment he used. It was obvious. Here's a light key in which it's obvious that we have afternoon light regardless of the notes that he used up there. I always said, you can't paint something that's local colored yellow with yellow paint or local colored green with green paint. There has to be a unique combination of colors that when put in arrangement will appear to be a yellow object in that situation or a green object in that situation. Yeah, that's where he made the point, Al, of the difference between, there's the old traditional value painters, and then that turned into value tonalism, which then the Impressionists came along and knocked that back with the color. So you end up having people like Chase who were colored tonalists. Sorolla, a colored tonalist, a fabulous colored tonalist. Now, where you get that is that in Sorolla's masses, he used beautiful, uniquely different colors, like a beautiful blue-violet shadow note and a beautiful, pale burnt orange light plane. But within that light plane and shadow note, he modeled with values of his mass note, as opposed to different color changes within the mass. And for all of his beauty and splendor, Sorolla, the fabulous colorist, he didn't take it as far as Henry did as far as the color modeling within the masses. The divisions in the mass.
The divisions within the mass themselves, the variations within the mass themselves, were done with value changes as opposed to Henry's strict color changes. But that's a perceptual thing. Sorolla did, according to his nephew that showed up at one of Henry's demos one day.
Was it his nephew or his grandson?
Yeah, grandnephew, grandson, something like that. And he said that Sorolla did, and they were on display the last Sorolla show that traveled around the U.S. Hundreds of these little color spot things, so that he could learn to see the masses of light and shade in color. But he never got to the point of understanding how to model in color. And where that's most easily seen is where you have a Sorolla portrait. These women, these beautifully colored dresses with the cool shadow notes and stuff, and there's this tonal head perched atop this beautifully colored dress and colored background. But you see that in modern American painters too. The conception of their head is a value head, and then it's decorated with color. So, people say, oh, you're just splitting hairs. No, I'm trying to say what is the difference between what Henry did and what everybody else has done. Henry conceived of the head as color volumes to start with and as a head second. And then when he modeled the first three masses, the forehead, the skull, the eyes, the nose, and the beginning of the muzzle, then the neck, were four distinctly different mass colors to start with before he ever started any modeling. So, other people start with the monochrome, light and shade to get it looking like the head they want, and then they start adding color to their values.
But Henry would start with a mud head.
Yeah, mud head in color. You like this, Al. It's funny. One night, Tom Moore, one of the street portraitists from Provincetown, Henry was going to do a pastel study of him for the class. And Tom brought a brand new box of Rembrandt, a 225 box of Rembrandt pastels for Henry to use. He didn't bring any old broken stuff. He brought Henry a whole brand new box. So Tom's sitting there, and Henry's got his spotlight on him, got another light on his board. And he's looking at Tom's head, looking at the box, and first thing he says is, hey, there's too many colors in here for me to use. It's too complicated. And he kept looking, and then all of a sudden he reached down in the box and got the burnt sienna, which is the strongest orange in a pastel box. It's even stronger than the cadmium. And he did the light plane just as a blob of this deep earth orange. Then he reaches down and gets the black and does the entire shadow side with black pastel as a block undernote. And turns around and says, don't tell anybody y'all saw the great Hensche using black. And he sniggered to himself. But then he went back. Pastels are so limited, he had to get the depth for the volume of his head first. And so he had to use the black, and then he started adding other things into the black, blues and reds and stuff. But he had to push it down to start with. But he worked on this thing, Al, and it had a glow of light bouncing around the thing, and by the time he was done, it was all luminous color, beautifully modeled. Of course, it was a likeness of Tom too, but it was also beautifully done. And one of the last things he's doing, he's drawing and modeling the planes of the nose, and he kind of sniggles to himself and reaches down the box and gets a scarlet red and puts a big red clown nose on it, takes the white, puts a dot on it, and sniggles to himself and rubs it off, and then goes back and beautifully models the nose back naturally again. So he was always playful and having fun, even when he was dead serious about stuff. But it was one of the most beautiful things you ever seen. And I don't have a slide of it. I don't know who does. But it was all the street pastel artists in Provincetown had come to the demo. And the old man was showing off. You guys think you can do something? He never said it because he was more humble than that. But he showed them in the same amount of time that they do on the street, in an hour and a half. He did a beautifully modeled museum quality head portrait in the same amount of time that they do their little knockoffs for their $300 on the street. So it was quite a lesson for everybody. But I hadn't thought about that in a while. It was really thrilling to watch him work.
Tommy, let me ask you this: what do you feel are the common pitfalls that many beginners make when they're painting block studies? What would you say is the most common pitfall that they fall into?
Well, the first thing is that people are in too big of a hurry. Mm-hmm. You know, they want to get to the point of making a picture, even though they know it's a study. They still want to get the drawing right and so forth and so on. Secondly, I think it's sometimes we're talking about just absolute rank beginners, is a certain unwillingness to be crude and look foolish in your own mind. I mean, you're certainly not going to look foolish to the other people because they're trying to do the same thing, and certainly not to the teacher. He's the one who told you to do it. But the idea of reaching down and taking up scarlet out of the tube on your knife and using it to make a light plane for something over there that you see that is obviously not that raw color makes you feel kind of uncomfortable and foolish. So you got to psychologically just get, none of that matters. You got to do what the old man says, do exactly, this, because we're talking about, this is a sequential developmental thing, and this is where we start. You don't start out as president of the bank, you start off sweeping and mopping the damn floors. People don't want to do that. And think about Hawthorne and Henry's early years. Most of the people they had come to them, a lot of them were already very famous people. They'd been doing magazine covers for years and made tons of money and all that, and were used to having that fine, beautiful little brush and be able to draw perfectly everything that they did. So to have somebody give you a 2-inch putty knife and say, I want you to make nothing but color planes out of raw colors of these objects in that head, it took a lot of, they had to humble themselves. Most people are unwilling to humble themselves when they're starting off from a level of success.
So you would kind of say that they have a tendency to look at it as foolishness. A bit foolish.
A bit foolish in that at the beginning they can't comprehend what's the purpose of this. I mean, I can already, I see over there that that's a pale pink and that's a medium blue. Why can't I just do that? Why do I have to make this scarlet and almost blue-black out of the tube? They don't understand that their perception has to be deprogrammed.
They have to break the mold.
A famous Presbyterian preacher went to Japan, like in the 50s or 60s. He wanted to talk to a Zen master about the mental and emotional transformation that people go through after having done years and years of meditation. The man came and they were having tea together, and the Zen master was pouring tea into the minister's cup, and as it got full, he kept pouring and it started running out all over the table. And all of a sudden it started running off on the floor, and the minister finally said, Stop, it's over full. And the Zen master sat down in the teapot and he says, yes, just like that cup, you're over full with your own speculations. Let's stop thinking that we know anything about this, and then we can start at the very bottom and truly understand it. Because unless we approach this as a child would, there's no way that we're going to understand it at all. And that was part of, Henry knew that you got to start at the very, very bottom, or you're not going to be able to understand and develop. And unless it's not so much master, but unless you have a complete comprehension of each stage of development, you'll never be able to go on to the next with any certainty or accuracy, and you shortchange yourself on the end. You'll never be all that you can be. You'll never reach the full potential of your own perception. I think there's a lot of psychological barriers. Number one is drawing. People are, especially people who draw well, are very unwilling to surrender their drawing abilities to do something naturally crude. Like Hawthorne's students used to say, so it's amazing how well we learn to draw with that putty knife. because we learned to finesse things and stuff, because they just could not bring themselves to do something that crude and what they thought to be that ugly. But of course, we see some of those old things now and we go, God, look how gorgeous that is. Because when you know what you're looking at, which is the color relationships, the rest of it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So those two things, Al, the psychological idea of not wanting to appear foolish, and this is stupid because, this is just too elementary for me, and the other is an unwillingness to be really, really crude, and to completely give up drawing until, like Henry said, until your colors are true, you've got nothing to draw with anyway. So don't worry about the drawing. In one instance, he always told every student, don't worry about the drawing, just get the notes about it. Well, Dan Neidhart, who Pat Marbury had carried up there with him one summer in the early 70s, Henry told him the same spiel and everything. When he came back around later, he said, Dan, you need to draw a little bit. Because Dan was just putting up blobs of color, and wasn't even making any attempt. He was taking Henry at his word. He said, Dan, you got to draw a little bit, and keep it as a plane.
Let me ask you this. Do you paint wet and wet, or do you allow your painting to dry?
It depends on what I'm after. They've reformulated all of our paints so they dry a lot faster than they used to. But if you're working on masses, it's really good for that to be wet so that you're adding another component and you want to mix it down into a homogenized note and so forth and so on. But if you're into specific modeling notes in developing a painting, it's best for it to be dry so that the undernote doesn't mix with this specific note that you're trying to make. Because like in the beginning, you're doing most of your mixing on the board. You put your blue up there and it needs a little green on it, probably needs a little violet in it, and then you go into this and you're adding them and stirring them in. But when you get to these very specific modeling of forms or recession of a tabletop, and you're doing these incremental notes, you're mixing each one specifically on your palette as a separate entity and putting it on. And so you don't want the other paint underneath mixing with that and tainting it one way or the other. So it all depends on, what is... That's like the idea of study per se. What is a study? Well, when you're a rank beginner, it's raw colors right off your palette into these different areas to make the beginning of the mass notes. And then there's the refinement of masses, and there's lots of... But as you develop, and let's say as you understand how to model, as you're capable of making a light key, as you're capable of keeping your modeling notes within the light key and not having them fall out, you're able to control your proportional shapes and so forth and so on. What is study then? Where does it go? Well, it's a higher refinement of each one of those other things as we go along. And the study of the edges, the study of the rhythmic flow of how this group of notes interplay with this group of notes. Charlie Miller, one of the last few years he was alive, he had done a study in which he explained to me that he realized when he set it up that all the shadow areas and the cast shadows had interesting relationships of very different kinds of blues, from turquoise to, maybe a violety blue. And the way he had set it up, he had wanted to lead the eye through the three-dimensionality of the composition. So he did that with this family of blues and the shadow notes by simply exaggerating one or two notes in each mass area. It caused the eye to go from one to the other to the other to the other. So what study is depends on how complex the ideas are that you're trying to understand. And that's what Henry did his entire life. Now there's also, Henry would work on a painting as a study, his mass notes, his big variations, so on and so on, and then he would finish it as a painting. Quite often he would do that.
Yeah.
And so he would get out of that study what he needed for himself, but then he would also go on to do the finessey parts, which also meant that he had a painting to sell to make a living so that he could keep on painting and not have to go dig ditches or something.
Yeah. When do you paint with a brush?
I don't.
You don't.
When I sign my name down at the corner. I have used brushes in the past.
Even a commission painting?
No, I don't do commissions.
You don't do commissions?
If somebody wants one of my paintings, I tell them, well, in November I'll have a group of paintings. You can come by and look and see if there's something that you like. I take it back, I have done one commission, but it was a commission on my own terms. Bryant Galleries, Brian Allen got me a commission to do a large interior mural-sized painting for a new bank that was going up in North Mississippi. And I stretched a 5 or 6 foot by 10 foot canvas and set it up by a big pond on my neighbor's land and worked on it for 6 weeks and made a giant frame for it, and we hung it and they liked it, so they kept it. But that was all done with a knife too.
Let me ask you this. Holding to the masses of color in still life and landscape, when do you bring the edges together and continue dividing the masses into color? You know?
And that's in reference, of course, to Henry wanting us to leave that white space between the big notes. He had people do that for several reasons. One, I don't want you drawing, trying to make it look like a pretty picture. But the other thing is that until those notes have been restated 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times, there's no reason to be fussing with edges and so forth and so on. But
once you see as much as if you're going around 3 times, say, would you say that, and you don't see any, you can't get the accuracy any better than what you see already, then there's a time when you bring it together, right?
Well, usually what happens, Al, for me, and I've noticed this over the years with a lot of people.
And then it depends on how many edges you see, too.
Well, it's as you're restating. Like, for example, if we've got a study and we've got a pot on our setup, and on our painting it's taking up, say, this amount of space, and we start off by putting one little note of color in the middle of that area, in the middle of each area, and then start spreading it out. Well, by the time we restate that note, it's getting a little bigger anyway. So that white around it tends to naturally evolve and disappear on its own as we're restating things, generally. So you really don't have to fuss and worry about it. Now that's in the early years of development. As your perception grows, and this reminds me of a story that Charlie Miller told me about one of Henry's demos, where Henry was showing off once again. As John says, his whole purpose in life was to mystify people. Sometimes the setup itself will show that there aren't any edges. There's a glow bouncing off of things, so that where the form turns, it doesn't have an edge. It simply slips into its surrounding area. Chardin was a master of that business.
You're kind of hitting on my questions before I even ask them all this. Because one question is that if every plane changes, the color change, what still life objects do you feel illustrate these changes the best? And I mean, Well, see, and that's interesting too, Al, in that if we look at it like this, the objects themselves are irrelevant. They are there to reflect color to the eye. That's their only purpose. And something irritates me, like people scratching on a chalkboard, is when people use these as separate terms. They use the word light and color. Light and color, light and color. No. It's the same thing. We perceive light as colors. That's how our perception understands luminosity and so forth and so on.
So light is the embodiment of color itself. So there's not this damn psychological separation of light and color, as with the objects. In this demo that Charlie was talking about, Henry had some white object set up as part of his arrangement, and there was this big halation bouncing off of it where the light was hitting, and it was so obvious that this glow was out there. And Henry mixes up a note on his palette, and the first note that he puts on his canvas is the halation. And Charlie goes, "What's the old man doing?" He said, "Going crazy." And then, just like with that brown note for a light playing in afternoon light, he goes on around, and as he barely has the canvas covered, Charlie said, he was fairly young then. He said, I could barely sit still and not just run out of the thing because I wanted to go back up the hill and start one of my own. I wanted to start one because Charlie had that revelation right then. It's not objects, it's light. It's all light.
It's light on the object.
It's light. We have never seen an object in our entire life. We've never seen one. We've seen the light reflected from that object after it's been processed by our perception. We have never seen this or that or you or me or this couch or my hat. We've never seen it. Even when we hold it in our hand and say, "Oh yeah, I've got it in my hand." No. We're seeing the light reflected from that object. So once a person breaks through that psychological barrier that, it's not object, it's not a head, it's not a portrait, it's not a tree, it's light. Once that happens, those edges disappear. They're no longer relevant as a tree, a pot, a head. They are a seamless whole of one note of color laying next to another note of color laying next to another note of color. Hawthorne said if I could get people to understand that when they look at their subject, if they would paint it as if they were copying a painting that they've already seen painted, one flat note of color right next to another flat note of color right next to another flat note of color, that the objects will create, Cezanne had said that too, the objects will create themselves, the tree will create itself, the head will create itself. If the color of that note and the proportion of that note and the placement of that note are true, everything else falls into place by itself, including the light key, including the modeling, including all of it. But we have this extreme attachment to form, the idea, the psychological idea that we live in a concrete reality, when we don't. The physicists have already proven that. All these little atoms here are going, and because they're the same density, I can't run my finger through them. They're here, I can run it through that one.
So it's like a visualist perception. It's a color visualist perception, like Sammy would say. It's not lines coming together.
Right.
It's edges coming together. Colors coming together.
It's volumes of light interplaying with one another. And where they interplay here and run into one another, we say, there's an edge. That's the perimeter of that object. When in truth, it's not. It's just more air and more light surrounding things. Al, that goes to the more complicated things that Henry tried to get people to understand about focal planes and focal points and focal areas and so forth and so on. Cezanne was one of the first ones to talk about this in color. And that is, you cannot violate the surface of nature, as he called it. In other words, when we see the light key, we've got to get more elementary than that. We've got a subject, a head, a landscape, a still life. Well, it's at a certain distance from us. Well, let's say, for example, that wall over there is the surface of our objects, and my retina is here. Between that object and this retina, there are 1,000,000 places that my eye could stop and read the scene. All the way to the point of sticking it right on the object, which is what most people do, and render the object. Or as Monet and Pissarro and a few others did, they took the retinal registration and painted the retina. They referenced the object from the retina. They didn't allow vision to go out and grab the object. They let the objects fill the retina, and that's why a lot of their paintings appear flat to people who don't understand what the guys were doing. But that's Cezanne's surface of nature. At each one of those levels is a different set or grouping of color notes. If I set my focal plane halfway between the object and my eye, there's a certain group of colors there that fit one relationship in one light key and form balance, etc., etc., etc. If I allow my concentration, my discipline, to start focusing deeper or shallower than that, I'm looking at a completely different set of colors. Now, what people usually do, Al, is their eye wanders all over the place. They look at the object, they look near the object, they look here, they look at there, and so what Henry did in his finest work is to establish a single focal plane at a certain distance from the eye and never deviated from it. He would have a focal point, like one small pot in the still life, and he would focus on that while the colors over here would be seen out the edge of the eye. When I look over there, it's a completely different color. It's only this color when I'm focused there. So, the reason I brought all that up, it goes back to your edges. When I'm looking here, there are no edges over here. There's simply the luminous glow of notes of color coming together. The closer those notes get to my focal point, the more obvious and the more shaped they become. And so there's a little more modeling there. There's no modeling here. There's massive variations. A little bit more modeling and variations. And then at the focal point, everything is modeled, the forms turn. I may even paint the light bouncing around the edge because that's where I'm focused. Whereas the luminosity becomes more nebulous as it goes out. So if we think about that in comparison to reaching down on the palette and picking raw yellow out of the tube to scrape on our first note, we're talking 3 lifetimes as the distance between that perception and that perception. But it encompasses everything Henry taught and everything he accomplished in his own work. It's that complicated and it's that complex and it has not one damn thing to do with making a picture or painting a portrait. There again, study and performance. Performance, people can paint any way they want to, and there are some wonderful painters in this country who do beautiful, fabulous things that I'm personally, and most other people, are totally incapable of touching or have that ability. Study is something completely different. Study is done for perceptual development, and it's approached a certain way because that way develops perception strategically and in a progressive manner. It's no different than a weightlifter. Used to, many eons ago, they just get more weights and they do what they could. Now they have figured out only by holding your arm a certain way with that weight are you actually developing the muscle. Only when your posture is a certain way are you actually strengthening your back. It's the exact same thing with Henry's method of study. There's this at the beginning, this comes next, these things are in the middle, and as we develop, we begin to take these other things into consideration as we go along. So, there again, back to the edges. From a certain standpoint, there are no edges. But, in our middle stage of development, when we're learning to model forms in planes, there are a billion edges because we're studying the structure of exactly how does that note come up against that note, and where does the color actually change there. And man, look, there's a third note straddling those two that's neither the object nor the background nor the edge. What is that? Well, it's the volume of light surrounding the object. So by disciplining ourselves and dissecting our subject, dissecting the color, basically dissecting our own perception, we acquire the tools and the ability and the perception to be able to do those beautiful and refined things that we have in our own mind that we think we can do when we're reaching for that yellow the first time we put on the board.
So you'd say it requires a real analytical mind, but an educated analytical mind to the point of the science of seeing. Yes,
I agree with that, Al. There's a lot of people who would disagree with it from the standpoint that there's a certain type of scientific analysis that is contrary to developing yourself in painting. But I think what you and I are talking about...
There's a scientific analysis pertinent to what Henry was doing.
Oh, yes.
And only Henry was the one that understood it because he was the pioneer. And when he imparted this knowledge to others, and as others grew in it, there's varying degrees in it.
Yeah.
You're one of the best I've interviewed on it, and that articulated it. Even Sammy never articulated the way
there
he
are
did.
a lot of people, if you listen to them talk about Henry and his painting, or about color per se, in order for what they say to be true, you have to erase all the laws of physics. You have to deny.
I didn't even understand what Henry was talking about for 1 year.
You have to.
It took me 1 year.
You have to deny that there is human perception that can be developed. You have to deny reality itself in order for what most people say about color painting to actually be true. For example, when we look at an object, what we're seeing is the light that has been rejected by the object. What we're seeing is the complement of what color the object actually is that we can't see because it has absorbed all that. In other words, when we see a chartreuse green, the object underneath that chartreuse green has absorbed all this beautiful red violet that we can't see fully. But when we study and make comparisons, there it is. It's hiding there. That reaction where the light has hit the object and is being absorbed and is being reflected, there's a layer there in which the red violet that's being absorbed and the blue the green that's being rejected are both playing in an interplay of wavelengths and molecules. Chardin could see it and didn't have the paints to do it. Henry could see it and had the paints, but it was so elusive that he said he was only able to actually get it to his satisfaction 5 or 6 times in his entire life. Along with Al, we were having this discussion about form versus key. And I asked Henry, I said, have you ever gotten to the point in one of your studies, one of your paintings, where you had to sacrifice some of the modeling to maintain the light key, or to sacrifice some of the light key, the specificity of the light key, in order not to lose any of your form? And which one did you choose? He said, yeah, you get to that point. He says, in those cases, I generally will sacrifice some of the light key because I never want to sacrifice any of the form. Now that kind of surprised me. But then he said, but I know that it can be done where you have to sacrifice neither, because I've done it 4 or 5 times in my life. Now, he had reached his ideal of his own ideas in paintings only 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 times in 75 years of painting. So that makes me irritated when I hear people think that they have mastered anything. When the master of the whole process says, I have only accomplished my goal 3 or 4 times in my own painting. And this is out of hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of paintings and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of demos and hundreds and hundreds of studies. Here I was satisfied 3 or 4 times that I nailed it. so you know, yeah, I miss the old man, and for one main reason.
Well, I got a few gifts for you. I think you know.
Al, is that as long as he was alive, even when he was no longer painting, when he was painting, he was the authority. When he wasn't, when he was no longer capable of painting, he was still the symbol of that authority. Now we don't have that. So people can say what they want to and make up what they want to and say he said this or that or that. But I find that most people have an agenda. And they start shaping what Henry had to say in a way that suits
their agenda.
Their agenda. For
Not
example,
for the good of the whole, like Henry would
but
say.
for themselves. Right. It's for themselves.
Because Henry used to say, we help one another and we all rise.
Right.
We all help one another
Right.
and rise. And to me, I think that was kind of part of one of the ideal schools that he used to think about. Because he used to think about the ideal school would be the one that would travel kind of like with the light, but that everybody would help one another, where there were shortcomings here, maybe one person could convey that to the other person,
people did do that at the school. Charlie and Hamrick and George Copeland, everybody was, all the old guys were always ready to help, and Henry actually expected the older guys to help the new people get started, so that he didn't have to constantly teach elementary school. He could at least get people to where they were doing their raw color studies and stuff, and then he could come around and that would give them he would take their palette and work on it and show them, now this is where you go from there. Right, you keep adding, and when you see that note up there is a little bluer, put a little blue in it. That one's a little oranger, put a little orange in it. Stir it around there, mix it up. And go around and see if you can't refine your masses. Or if somebody had begun to learn modeling and they had got all these planes up there and none of them were holding where they were supposed to. It looked like a yin checkerboard. Right. He'd take their palette and knife and smear them all together. And the person would go, I just spent 3 days modeling all that. And Henry smeared it back into masses and then would model it. In 15 minutes, would model one object and a section of tabletop from his vision.
Right.
And then he would hand the palette and knife back to the person and says, now, see, that's what you got to do. Go on and finish it.
Right.
Now, you'd often see some few people start working on it. Most people would look around and take it off the palette and go hide it as their memento of Henry. And Henry would sign a lot of these later on. And some of these things he'd take palette from people and stand there and work on them an hour and completely do the entire study as a study. And there are quite a few of those floating around the country. Great lessons for people.
Like when you're studying, Henry used to say, if you study too long, you see the complementary colors. And let me ask you this. That's true, because I know I've seen it, and in this documentary that I saw by BBC, they proved it, okay? The question I want to ask is, I think it was coined once before that this...
Oh yeah, we're talking about aggressive seeing.
Yeah, but what my question is, as you grow in seeing, in the seeing process, do you find that you can endure longer bouts of seeing? Do you find before seeing the complementary color? Not that I'm writing a science book.
But it's a good question, Al, and it depends on the individual. What has generally happened to me is that I don't see complements. I just go colorblind. The color just disappears. Usually that only happens, even for most people, is if you're doing a lot of staring. You're looking at that object and looking at that note. What is that? What is, you're trying to wring its neck. Come on, tell me what y'all. But what Henry told us to do was to keep the eye moving. Don't ever stare, but we're going to stare. But when you keep your eye moving and you usually are able to see a note out of the corner of your eye, oh, that's it, it's got a little more green in it. A little Mars orange with some white in it, I'll do that. So you keep your eye moving. It's interesting that idea of aggressively studying, being really intense with your concentration, because there are certain periods where that's exactly what's called for. Then on the other hand, Henry got on to me for working too fast. He said, you work too fast. He said, you need to consider the note longer. And I said, what do you mean, Henry? I need to look at it longer? He said, no, you're not listening to me. He said, you need to consider the note longer. I said, well, what does that mean? He says, know what you see before you reach for your paint. I said, well, that's, fast or slow or whatnot. And he said, I don't care how fast you stick the paint on there. What I'm talking about is knowing what you're seeing before you reach for the paint. He says, that means standing there and waiting a minute. And don't go at it like you're fighting a fire. You're looking and you're comparing. You're looking and you're comparing. And all of a sudden, you'll realize that you actually do see that note. Then mix it and put it up there. Then do that with the next one. Just slow down. And what I ended up developing that in myself, in my own work process, I call it learning how to wait. Stand there and wait. I had a still life that I worked on 50 times 8 or 10 years ago. Worked on it 2 different springs. And I would go out by my setup and I would stand and hold my palette and wait. I would look away. And I would not put down a note until it presented itself to me. Oh, yes. Sometimes I might work on this an hour and a half and maybe only put down 8 or 10 notes, modeling notes. I remember one time going out, I'd worked on it maybe 40 times at this point, going out, talking about going colorblind. I went out, looking at the study, look at it. I couldn't see anything. Even say a blue object, when I looked at it, I didn't even see any local color. It's like I was completely colorblind. Everything was gray. And I looked and I walked off, walked around the yard a minute, walked back, looked at it, nothing. I did this for about 15 or 20 minutes. And then when I got to the point where, I just need to give up, I looked back over at it. All of a sudden, every individual note on every object, the table, the background, all presented themselves to me at the same time. It was almost like you'd walked over here and shoved me into the wall. And I actually lost my balance from it. It was completely overwhelmed. It's like 1,000 different little small color notes came into the eye, into the perception all at once. So I went from being totally colorblind to seeing all of it because the mind had let go of looking. So it wasn't intently looking at all anymore. It had actually pulled back and relaxed and was not projecting anything out at the subject, and so it presented all itself. It was so overwhelming, all I could do was put up. I didn't even paint on it that day. So it all depends on the situation. When we're beginners and we're working on masses and you see that shadow's moving because the light's changing, you want to get the notes up fast and get them stirred in and homogenized and get your variations going and all that kind of stuff. And then when you're first learning to model, making those different planes, you're mixing that specific note and you're looking at the one right next to it. And you're doing intensity like you're talking about, very aggressive, intensive looking. But then there are periods that you come to, like when you've set up a painting or a study where the relationships, I don't want to use the word sophisticated, they're extremely complex because every note is a compound color. There's nothing you could point to and say, oh yeah, that's obviously blue or that's obviously red, Or it's a red, violet, green. It's a blue, gray, brown. There's something about them that it's going to take time to get to that color.
Right.
Okay, I got to start with something. Okay, it's got enough blue in it. I'll start it with the blue, knowing that's going to have almost little to do with it at the end. And so you're slowly cultivating these colors, like raising a crop somewhere. And there again, if you've got a landscape or a still life set up, and you've decided that this is going to be the star of the show. So we know that when we're looking at that, other things, how things are developed can become very complex and complicated. And the more complex and complicated they become, the more complex and complicated every note becomes. So therein, you can't aggressively and intensely search for them. You have to let go and step back and allow your perception to see all of it at once, and then it will fall on the thing that becomes obvious. You remember in the very beginning, Henry would say things like, wait until the most obvious thing presents itself. Paint the color that's most obvious to you from the beginning. Well, even in the most subtle things, what is most obvious will present itself to you. So the fundamental principles apply no matter how complex the color gets. Me and Jim Beatrice, he's from Boston, he was down visiting with me one Christmas, and we were going flicking through Henry's slides, and we were looking at indoor still lifes. And we're clicking and clicking and clicking, and all of a sudden, both of us spontaneously jumped up and went over to the screen, and we're looking, and we looked at each other, and Beatrice says, well, he says a little cuss word, shakes his head, and we both started laughing, because we had realized at the same time the subtlety of Henry's work. It's like, had nothing to do with the objects, had nothing to do with color per se. It had to do with him being the magician of light itself. He saw light and he painted light. And the fact that it's a beautiful still life was totally secondary to those beautiful color relationships. For example, that sheet I sent you, that one that's almost grays and browns except for the turquoise inside the cup. I saw that painting in person, but when you looked at it, every one of those little notes are completely different colors. They're not value variations of anything. Every modeling note is totally and uniquely different. But you'd be damned if you can say, oh, I know what that is, that's a blue violet. No. There's no way to describe most of the colors on that painting. Oh, well, it's a red, green, violet, orangey tan. Yeah, that's exactly what it is. But it ain't gray.
Well, Joe Zarek used to say that. You know, he says we need to get away from words per se.
Yeah.
And thinking, you know, of course, that's the only way you can really describe what you see in any way. Because if, you know, it comes to a point where words doesn't suffice at all.
Right, and until we start thinking, you're exactly right, until we start thinking in color. Not in the word of the color, but in color itself. And you know, that's something Sammy tried to get people to understand for years and years and years and years. It's colors! You've got to think in color.
Because there's no name for the tertiary colors.
Yeah.
There's so many mixtures and so many blends, you know, and there's so many different keys.
Oh, and it's why the old man said, I know a student is finally beginning to make real progress when I see him moving into the colors which have no name. Exactly, exactly. You know, sure, we can still call it a blue, but if you took any blue and put up next to it, the blue within that note would completely evaporate. That's something that Delacroix understood. For all of his raw color and contrast and stuff, he understood nuance.
Eugene Delacroix.
Yeah. He was telling some young students one time. He said, you know, it's real interesting to hear all of the salon painters, the studio painters, talk about all their beautiful violets and reds and turquoises and stuff as their paintings are being carried by hand through the streets of Paris from their studios to the salon show. So the sunlight's on them, they go, oh, look at my beautiful violets. And Delacroix says, yes, but just as soon as they're taken out of direct sunlight and put back inside, they're exactly what they are, gray, brown, and black. There's no color at all in those paintings. He was making 2 points. Number one, those people were being foolish. And number two, that the light itself is color. And if you're not dealing with that right here, then this other stuff is just words. I mean, it's just, you know, they're calling them words, but it has nothing to do with the actuality of color. Oh, this is an interesting lesson, and you can edit some of this out if you want to.
Oh yeah, a lot of it's going to be edited.
Now I'm just mean this particular, you might erase. In '88, yeah, because I'd carried Sammy and Kay Benton up there with me that summer. That last summer I went. Di and Henry were having a big fight in the house, and Sammy could hear it. This one we were painting in Henry's backyard after he'd lost the school, And so Sammy went to the house to make sure wasn't nobody getting hurt.
Was this gray? Oh,
No, it was in Provincetown. And so Sammy went up to the house and went in to separate them. Not because he was afraid Henry was going to hurt Dottie, because he was afraid Dottie was going to wallop Henry. So I was up there in my Bronco, and so Sammy brought Henry outside and says, "Won't you take Henry for a ride for an hour or two until I get Dottie calmed down and we see what's going on?" So me and Henry walked over to the school and got in the truck, and we drove down to Truro, and we drove around to Race Point, and but all of that was just preamble to this. We're riding along, Al, down the road, and all the grasses have gone to seed, and the afternoon light was on and everything, and Henry's saying, "Man, look at that," and pointing out the colors that he saw. He was naming the colors that he saw. And he said, that's something real important to remember. He said, not only do people fall back into tonalism, even after they've studied color, they'll go back to making value variations of their colors. He said, and of course, the colored tonalism, which is like Sorolla with the bright colors for the masses, but just value variations of that same color in the mass. He says, but there's another thing that you need to be aware of, and he says it's saturated local color. He said people will paint with saturated local color and think that they're painting the color of the object. In other words, they've got a red object or a green one or a blue one, and they pump the red up to high heaven or the blue or the green, and the color looks so vivid and strong, everybody starts to say, "Oh, what a colorist this person is." He says it has nothing to do with anything, because of course it has nothing to do with any light key or relationship. It's simply saturated local color. So when people will be out in the landscape and see a blue sky and a green tree or yellow sunlight on the dead grasses or whatnot, and they pump those colors up to a raw stage, the saturated local color, he said that's just as damnable as anything else, because it has nothing to do with the relationships we see in nature. When I came down to Thibodeau and picked him up, the time Dottie tried to throw him down the stairs and drove him home to stay with us for a few days. We're in the truck for like 6 hours, and to keep him from talking about socialism and the hay diet, you get him talking about painting. And he, all the way home until it got dark, he was talking about all the colors that he was seeing in the trees, and especially where the tops of the trees were coming against the sky. And that was one of the first things, we were driving down the road in the afternoon. He says, that sure is a funny, cool pink in the top of those trees, isn't it? And I got to looking, and I couldn't see it at first, because I was driving, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw what he was seeing. So I got all these lessons from him, not while we were standing in front of the easel, but while we were cruising down the road, either on the Cape or up through the countryside. And it's what he did is so perceptually complex. Until people completely get away from the idea of their subject matter and their pictorialism, and especially drawing, they can't have a real comprehension of what the man was trying to do, and certainly not what he was trying to teach them. Recently, somebody I know was trying to start an argument about stuff, saying that, well, that's not really a nature study, because all those planes and stuff are artificial, and blah, 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 blah. But you see, it was being deceptive. It was a color study. It wasn't a nature study. And that person had used that word on purpose in order to say, by making color plane changes of a mass of trees, that you're somehow lying and making a deception about nature. No, you're studying color relationships.
In nature.
Yeah. We're not making leaves. We're studying the large color plane changes that encompass the volume of that tree in that lighting situation. So right there, Al, until people will admit that there is a study method in color per se, and that there are these stages that we go through, then you can't deal with that person as to helping them learn anything. You're going to edit all this stuff anyway, but
Oh yeah.
you've got so many of Henry's students that were really some of his very best students who have basically decided that, because they're drawn to academic painting, academic traditional painting, that they've hybridized Henry's color onto the academic thing and said this is what Henry was teaching. How many times have you heard Henry cuss and raise Cain about this is not about color being an adjunct to academic drawing. This is not color being an adjunct and add-on to value painting. It's something completely different from that. He was an iconoclast. He was destroying the old and bringing in the new. He didn't do it right off. It took him years to wean himself. This man mastered value painting while he was still in his 20s.
But that's why the faculties of the universities didn't really like him, because they didn't understand it.
Well, of course, and what he was preaching was destroying everything they were saying was great and good and true. He's telling them what you're teaching is old hat and obsolete. Not what I'm teaching. What I'm teaching endures forever. It's the blah, 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 blah.
But the student bodies were always intrigued.
Well, of course.
Yeah.
And so you've got all these different people hybridizing things and pushing their own agenda and their own point of view. And what it always comes back down to this, though, Al, is this one thing, is drawing. People are unwilling to sacrifice academic traditional draftsmanship for color to be everything that it can be. Henry said it took him until the winter of 1960 to eliminate all forms of tonal thinking from his own perceptual abilities. Took him that long. He was 61 years old before he managed to erase what he had mastered before he was age 30. And how much criticism and humiliation did he have to take from having done these masterful paintings, some of them as good or better than Hawthorne's for sure. When he's out here painting ladies in bright yellow dresses with raw red scarves around their heads, and he's painting their faces pink and their hair blue. After he has mastered this other. He started right where he had us start, with the raw, the crude, the humiliating, the thing that required you to show some humility before nature and before these ideas, or you weren't going to learn anything. And we can go back and look at all of his crude as he developed, and he's still doing these beautiful hybrids, these things that are colored tonalism, and then more color than tonalism, then finally almost completely color rendition without any thought of values coming into his thinking, and then he seamlessly evolved right on into being a color painter. Now, part of the problem with that, when he said, I gave you people a 20-year head start, so you wouldn't have to go through that, listen to what I'm telling you, and you can become a colorist from the beginning. People try to take the fact that Henry had academic training, Henry had all this academic study, that Henry was a value painter first, that Henry drew all the time, because Henry loved drawing, and he was a master draftsman. They try to take all that and say that we're supposed to go through all that too. When Henry said just the opposite, no, it's obsolete, get rid of it. This is how we do. We do color this way. We study color this way. We develop our perception this way. Then at that point, our drawing is of the most natural sort because it's volumes of light being reproduced over here as volumes of color relationships. What could be more natural than that? We did not delineate the object at all. What we did was have a note of color that encompasses all this volume, just as the light reflecting to the eye as colors was encompassing all this volume in nature. that traditionalism has not one damn thing to do with what Henry taught. And the fact that he went through it is beside the point. When Henry went to Hawthorne kept saying, Henry, that's dead. There's no color. But I don't want to do all that. I want to paint like you. No, Henry, what I do is a dying art form. What I'm trying to teach you is about the future. This is the future. What I'm doing is dead and gone. And I'm doing it in order to keep making a living so I can stand here and teach all you people about the future. But Henry resisted as long as he possibly could. He wanted to paint like Hawthorne. He didn't want a damn thing to do with color, per se, except the kind of subtle, exquisite things Hawthorne was doing.
Well, I think he said something to me one time. In fact, I think I have him on video saying that there was a point where Hawthorne came to him and said, take it right out the tube and put it right on a pigment, right on a canvas, if you have to. And it's what he was saying. He's saying that was one of the reasons why a lot of people misconceive what Monet did, because Monet wasn't trying to do impastato with texture on the painting. He was trying to get the purity of the pigment.
Trying to get the notes as powerfully as he could. Right. Exactly.
And Henry said that, well, if that's what you said, why didn't you mean it? Why didn't you say that? If that's what you meant.
Yeah. I remember one night he'd had a couple of beers and he said, I thought to myself, well, you small bitch, why didn't you say that from the beginning? And I could have done it already. He did say one time, he said, I got so tired of hearing him carp about color, I figured I'd get him. He said he went out from the school, set up a bright little still life, and did just that. Get it as raw as he possibly could. He said, I'll show him, I'll shut him up. Kind of like Leon going to show Henry by throwing paint around on the floor. Right. So Henry's raw thing is there on the screen with everybody else's stuff, and Hawthorne comes in and sees it, and he knows who did it, and he looks at Henry and says, that's it, Henry. That's exactly what I've been trying to get you to do. And Henry he wanted to strangle him, but he finally understood, like you're talking about. Why don't you tell me that to start with? Raw out of the tube. This is where we start, and then we go on from there.
I think I've got plenty enough, man.